Greetings, YouTubers. My name's Eric Kiska, owner and founder of Firelake Media, and I'm here with documentary filmmaker and director Andrew Templeton for a Firelake Chat, a series I'm introducing on this YouTube channel where I interview interesting people around the Great Lakes region. Andrew is currently screening his new documentary film, 1969, Killers, Freaks, and Radicals, a documentary about the Michigan murders in the late 60s, murders that for a long time many thought to be the crimes of one lone serial killer named John Norman Collins. But in Andrew's documentary, new research and testimony has been brought to light that may suggest that these murders were not the work of one lone man. So first off, Andrew, how's it going? Tell us a little bit about yourself, and I guess tell us how you got into documentary filmmaking, too.
Hey, Eric. Thanks for having me on. I've been, into film and video really my whole life, and worked in the corporate world as a videographer for my whole career, and I've helped out on friends' projects, but this is my first feature-length documentary project. I had always wanted to make a feature-length documentary, and I was living in the Ann Arbor area about 7-8 years ago. I moved over there for a job, and I found the book, The Michigan Murders, at a local library in the local interest section. And I was just fascinated that these crimes had happened here, and it was in the middle of such social and political turmoil, such a fascinating point in history in general, on a national level, but also local, because, that area is home to the University of Michigan, Eastern Michigan University. There was a lot of campus unrest and politics going on. So I just kind of started looking into the case, and I think originally I naively thought maybe I would do some kind of a summary or an overview. And then once I started actually talking to people and doing some deeper research, I started to think, well, I think there's more to this, or this could use a fresh perspective. And I also didn't feel that anyone had, I guess, tried to place the crimes in the context of the time and the social atmosphere that they took place. So, that started the journey about 7 years ago, and went to a lot of archives, made a lot of sometimes unusual phone calls. And then once I was in it, and once I started, I thought there was more that could be known publicly about the cases or understood. And I just kept going. So
that's so interesting, man. So I guess let's start out. You did say the social atmosphere of the time. Did when he was actually convicted, were the Manson murders going on at that whole trial? Was that going on at the same time, or was it a little bit?
I'm fairly convinced that that's why these cases aren't better known. They are known to people over a certain age, usually in Southeast Michigan in particular, tend to be familiar with it because it was such a visceral memory and a frightening time. But in general, with so much true crime out there, I hadn't, there aren't a ton of podcasts that cover it. Some have. And I mean, I made the movie pretty much because I went looking for a feature-length documentary that I assumed must exist, and it didn't yet. But I mean, to bring the Manson murders into that, I think that's a big reason why, because these were national headlines across the country as the murders continued here locally. And then John Norman Collins was caught, and that was national headlines. And often part of that was, is this a group of people? Did he have accomplices? There was a manhunt for one of his accomplices by the FBI. Within a week, the Tate LaBianca Manson murders occurred. And that just was such a sensational crime. And then it, later turned out to be this kind of cult murder by these crazed hippies, and it involved Hollywood. And I think it just totally overshadowed it in the zeitgeist. similarly, when his Collins trial took place the following year, the Manson trials were going on, and they
Mm.
were all, acting kind of like lunatics during the
Yep.
trial. So that was another media sensation. And as a result, I think these things got largely forgotten in a broader national way, and definitely to people under a certain age around here. Because part of my fascination was that I had never heard of it.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. So I guess let's backtrack a little bit here for people that might not know about the Michigan murders or John Norman Collins. Could you tell me a little bit about the background of John Norman Collins? Where did he grow up? Where was he born? How was his childhood?
He was born in Windsor, across the river, Canadian citizen, and his birth name was John Chapman. That was his father's name. And then, there's a lot of different speculation, and I've heard different stories. Some of the books you can read, Michigan Murders and Terror in Ypsilanti, are the two primary books. They go into this or try to go into it in detail. But there's some theory that perhaps his birth father was, traumatized from service in World War II. Whatever happened, his mother divorced him and moved across the river to Detroit, and he grew up in Centerline. And then he had a stepfather named Collins, which is where the Collins names comes from. And there's some kind of speculation that he may have been a somewhat violent or harsh man, but there was nothing I could find definitively. And I guess that's what's kind of curious. And one of my revelations doing this is Collins I'm sure he had issues in his childhood, and there may be something that we don't know about. But based on the research I did and people I talked to, there wasn't any, there's no documentation of animal abuse or setting fires or rampant criminality, which is often the case with serial killers. There are, pathological signs of abnormal behavior. His mother being divorced, I think, was a source of struggle because it was a very Catholic community. He went to a Catholic high school, St. Clement's, and I think the surrounding community looked down on his mother for that, and that she dated different men and whatnot. And as far as I want to get into that, there's all kinds of speculation about that. But the conclusion I came to was if something bad happened or he had a rough childhood, I found no indication that it was a particularly rough childhood or anything highly, highly unusual for someone growing up in the suburbs at that time.
Was he abused a little bit at all, or by the men in his life, or anything like that?
Like I said, all I heard was speculation that possibly his father may have been like that and his stepfather. But I never heard about it in a particularly extreme way. It's certainly possible, but I didn't find that in my research, and I don't know if that's been forgotten. But I guess what's interesting to me is that sometimes people I think do become serial murderers, and it can be a bit of a mistake to focus entirely on the childhood, because there are plenty of people who have pretty rotten childhoods who don't go on to commit serial murder.
Definitely. Then he ended up going to Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti. What year did he get there to Eastern Michigan?
I believe he went to Central first.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
He went to Central for a year.
Yeah.
And I believe that was 65, 66.
Okay.
Because he arrived in Ypsilanti either late 66 or 67, right about when the murder started in the summer of 67. And so that was I believe it was his sophomore year. And he had been, I don't know if he didn't get along socially or what, but I know he was writing a lot of letters, and some friends convinced him to transfer to EMU. So he not a whole lot is known about Central. I don't know if there's any kind of strange things going on up there. Didn't find anything in my research, and the university doesn't know anything, or won't release any files anyway. So
Gotcha. So he went to EMU 66 to 67, and then when did these murders? When did the first murder take place that we know of?
Yeah, the first that we know of was a girl named Mary Flazar, and that was in the summer of 1967. I believe it was in July. She was basically just going on a walk near her off-campus apartment in a car. The witnesses saw a car pull in front of her, pull into a driveway, and try to get her to get in the car. And she said, no, no, no. And then the guy kind of squealed his tires, went around the corner. She walked around the corner. The car came around again like it was following her. And then nobody heard from her since. And she was within visual distance right across the street from her apartment. So nobody really knows what happened, except they both did work in the student union, which was called the McKinney Union. It's still a building at EMU, but it's not the student union anymore. But they both worked there, and it was kind of supposed that they may have known each other a little bit socially, or were acquaintances, and perhaps that's how he got her into the car. But yeah, that one, there's not a ton of information other than somebody was trying to pick her up in a car that matched a car he drove at the time, roughly. And then she was discovered like a month or almost a month later. She was gone for quite a while. And due to that length of time, there wasn't a lot of great forensic information to go on. And at the time, it was a pretty shocking thing to have occurred. But the police, I think they largely treated it as a lone incident. And I'm not sure. I'm sure it scared people at the time, but it didn't, not as much as the following years would.
Yeah, and I do want to paint a little picture for our viewers here. In July of 1967, that's also when the Detroit Rebellion happened. There was all these rebellions and riots all across the country at this point. So, and we were in the thick of Vietnam, and it kind of felt like back then, if you talk to some people from back then, it felt like the end times a bit. Like social upheavals everywhere, war. It was pretty insane, right?
Oh yeah, I mean that was something, because I use newspapers and archives a lot for research, and just seeing looking for information, say about the first murder, the things going on simultaneously in society were often very distracting because it was fascinating. Like you said, Vietnam War, the uprising had just happened in Detroit, and I remember considering even including the riot in the movie somehow, because this took place like right afterward. But only in the sense that I think Ann Arbor at that time felt like it was a little bit safer, or it was away from the big cities where these things happen. But then obviously a lot of student and political unrest due to the Vietnam War and other social issues started to impact the area.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so I guess take me through the next few murders here up to when he got caught.
So the next one, and I'll just run through it quickly.
Yeah, it's probably, there's 7 different ones, right?
I know. It's tough. I mean, even in the film, editing it down to what I had to just choose the most important facts when there's probably 80,
Yeah, for sure.
But anyway, the second one, it was a full year later, and it was a woman named Joan Schell, and she was going to meet her fiance at U of M. She was an EMU student, and she just missed the last bus that went by, and 3 guys pulled up in a car and said, "Oh, come on, get inside, whatever." So she got inside to hitchhike, which was very common back then. It didn't have the reputation that it grew to in the 70s and now. It was very common for people to hitchhike rides between the two campuses. And there's some thought her roommate thought they were the boys in the car were familiar, and they were all three clean-cut white men. One had a EMU shirt on, and then she was seen a bit later by Colin's fraternity brother and his girlfriend walking with Joan to his car, like they had maybe gotten into another car. And then she vanished, and she was found about 5 days later north of the city. And again, it was a pretty, these were all very brutal crimes, not to get into the details of it, but that was part of what shocked and scared people. And there's never any attempt to hide bodies, which is kind of a strange psychological thing to do. A lot of serial killers try to conceal what they've done, and there seemed to be a desire for recognition or shock. But I guess what's interesting in that one, and the movie focuses quite a bit on that one, is there were the men in the car with him. There were two other witnesses who saw him with her. He lived directly across the street from her. There was a lot of stuff pointing directly in his direction. He was in the alumni office where he worked, talking all about the case and describing gory details to people. And people were, the woman at the alumni office reported him to the police. The police go to him. They realize, oh, he's the nephew of David Like, who's a corporal in the state police at the local post. So it's somewhat speculation, but they quickly eliminated him as a suspect. They didn't seriously check out his alibi. They kind of ignored the witness testimony and just dropped him. And then another 9 months went by, which it's very frustrating because they should have solved the case at that one very clearly. But because of I think his physical appearance, his connections to the state police, they just didn't think he was the type. And of course, the guys in the car, who, I think were probably just involved, but they certainly never came forward. So then then it gets to the next year, 1969, and then the murders started happening quite frequently. Like some of them were days apart, some of them were 4 or 5 weeks apart.
Always found in public too?
Yes. Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah.
And almost always there was some indication of getting in a car or hitchhiking or something like that, and then being found in an area usually north of town. There is one murder in March, a woman named Jane Mixer, who is kind of an outlier, and there was a different guy convicted in 2005, actually. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a whole story in itself that's worth looking into because of some strange DNA results.
But yeah, his name was what? Gary Earl Lederman, right?
Yes.
Yeah. We could touch on him later, but there was one other guy who was convicted way later.
Yeah, which is interesting for a couple reasons. One thing is because that was considered a part of the series for a long time, and then there was somebody else was convicted. Although that one, the methodology in the MO of the murder is entirely different than the other 6 in the area. So I think even police at the time, like the more, I think, shrewd detectives, kind of thought it was an outlier. So anyway, then there was Marilyn Skelton, 16-year-old from Romulus, Dawn Basom, Alice Calum, and finally Karen Beineman in this area. And I don't know how much.
Well, I guess there was all signs of torture for all of them, right? And was there signs of sexual assault for all of them too, or?
Yes, and that's what differentiates these from the Jane Mixer case. Is Jane Mixer was likely shot in a car, like in the passenger seat of an automobile, and then dragged to a spot on a grave, but she was mostly clothed, and it was staged in this way that was more, that also seemed to imply one person, whereas several of the other cases had at least circumstantial evidence that there were multiple people. Say there was, bodies put in the grass where there was multiple paths through the grass, or there was no drag marks on the bodies of the road, things that to investigators I talked to said that they thought it seems like circumstantially there's indications that 2 or 3 people were trying to control this situation or participating. And yeah, they were all, except for Jane Mixer, they were sexual crimes, and they were very violent crimes of a sadistic nature, involving either sometimes a blunt object, sometimes knife, sometimes a weapon, a .22 pistol.
Gotcha. All right, so yeah, I guess let's get to how John Norman Collins ended up being caught. And you said it was in 1969 when he ended up being caught, right?
Yeah, I believe it was. It's unclear the exact date. It's either July 31st or August 1st. But that's whenever he was at the Plymouth, Michigan State Police Post when they arrested him. But what happened was the final murder in this area, because there was at least one in California during this time too. Karen Beineman was walking, and she got picked up by someone on a motorcycle. They later found out he had asked at least 7 women in broad daylight to get on that motorcycle before the 8th one relented. And she was new to campus, and again, he's clean cut. And I just think it must have seemed harmless or no way,
The city fathers, the prosecutor, the sheriffs, all of law enforcement, they said, we're looking among the freaks and radicals and hippie element for the killer. That captured exactly what was wrong with their mentality. The ideal was clean-cut, tall, handsome, join fraternities, play football, a man's man.
But anyway, that murder, they found out, ended up occurring at his state policeman uncle's house in the basement while the family was on vacation.
David Like was the guy's name, right? So it was the Like family. Yeah.
Yeah, when they came back home, he did report to superior officers that there was things missing in the basement and weird stains, and I think he had already at least begun to suspect John in the weeks prior, as the police started focusing in on him. But I do want to say, I think primarily responsible for his capture was some basic but shrewd police work by a guy named Larry Mathewson, who's has since passed but is featured prominently in my film. And he was a detective for EMU, and he got tasked to walk around and look at motorcycles on campus, and take down numbers. And he remembered, he thought, I was driving past that intersection and I recognized that guy because he's in another frat. And he was talking to some girl on his motorcycle. So he went over there, and the situation was shady, and the license plate on the motorcycle was bent up like this, like there was a crease, so you could tell that somebody had been messing with it so that it couldn't be identified. And he was buying new license plates. A likely accomplice of his walked in and said, "Here are your new license plates." So he, I guess, to me, unlike many others who looked at Collins, didn't seem fooled by his appearance or the clean cutness, and just said, well, things are pointing towards this guy. So he looked at his work records. He took pictures to witnesses around the wig shop that he had stopped at with Karen Beineman. And then essentially everything just led to John, and they started surveilling him. And that coincided with Corporal Like coming home and finding things amiss in his basement. So that led to his capture.
And if I'm not mistaken, also, there was a mishap by the police where they questioned him 2 days before he was actually captured, right? And then that kind of gave him a head start to start hiding a bunch of evidence.
Absolutely. Actually, I think it's worth mentioning too, briefly, even before that, when they were looking for him, they found Karen Beineman's body, and they knew that there had been indications that the killer was possibly coming back to the scene, either leaving things or messing with the body. And so they removed the body and put a mannequin in this ravine on a rural road, and they set a stake out. And somebody came to the stakeout, and some young guy was looking over the bushes, and they yelled stop, but they weren't set up properly, and they didn't have enough officers on the scene, et cetera, et cetera. He runs away into the night. They don't catch him. What's interesting to me about that is the night that occurred, it's pretty much verified by witnesses, multiple witnesses, that Collins was over an hour away in Ortonville riding motorcycles. So if someone came to that body, it was somebody else who knew where that body was.
Wow. And then I think, was it the first victim? There was people in the family that said that a strange man appeared at her funeral, or was that a different victim?
No, that was the first victim. Okay. And I didn't find a whole lot of information on that, but I guess it did happen. Somebody came and said they wanted to take pictures of the body, but they could never get a good description. So it was kind of I'm sure it could have been Collins or somebody connected to him, but it's also, these cases also attract a lot of strange people sometimes for attention. So it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility that it was just some strange person looking for attention.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then you said like 2 days before.
Sorry. Yeah. I wanted to
okay.
say, I just wanted to say the mannequin thing because it's another interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah.
One, it's a big screw up by the police, which the governor ended up taking over the investigation. It was a big embarrassment. And then, yes, when they finally went to talk to him, they were supposed to just surveil him, but to Ann Arbor, I don't know what was in their head, but they went and talked to him, and he said, I'm tired. I'll come talk to you in the morning and we'll figure this out. And they let him go, which I would point out again is a bizarre way to treat the suspect of multiple murders at this point. They let him go home, and his roommate later told detectives that he had loaded a box full of women's clothing and left the house late at night. And there was clothing missing from all the victims pretty much, and none of that was ever recovered. So presumably he destroyed it, and then by Monday he'd hired a lawyer and they arrested him.
Wow. And this was like pre-John Wayne Gacy, pre-Ted Bundy. So I think overall there still wasn't as much known about serial killers at this time.
There wasn't as much study, and the serial killer term did not exist. Mm-hmm. However, it's a little bit of a misconception that it never happened. Like, it did happen, and people were aware of the idea of like a mad killer. Like the Boston Strangler case was a huge thing.
Jack
just
the Ripper.
A few years prior.
100 years ago.
Jack the Ripper kind of was the first highly publicized one. Yeah. So this was like a concept people were aware of. Now, the law enforcement in this area certainly had never dealt with it on this scale. And you are correct to say there wasn't a lot of study, and we certainly know a lot more about it now and how to deal with it.
Yeah, and I know that that Mindhunter show took a lot of liberties, but that was somewhat true that at one point the FBI they started looking at all these serial killer cases, and they're just like, I know there's a pattern here. There's some kind of distinct psychological profile that carries over, and that probably hadn't happened yet in the late 60s, right?
Yeah, it was. It seems more speculative. Like they would go to medical, they would go to like the medical director at the local psychiatric hospital, and they would just kind of make guesses, And sometimes they weren't bad guesses, but there wasn't. Yeah, there hadn't been a real study of like the patterns and motives and predictable parts of it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was strange in that respect, and it was certainly something that this area never dealt with before. And the victimization of young women, one as young as 13, I think was just terrifying. I know that it was not uncommon for parents to be reluctant to send their daughters to school at EMU
Yeah.
and UMich because these killings just seemed to keep going on, and nobody seemed to be able to stop them or do anything about it.
Women felt vulnerable and helpless and didn't know who to trust.
I had 2 female roommates. We were terrified of this killer who went after brown-haired girls. I remember sitting around the apartment with my roommates and talking about, geez, this could happen to me. It could happen to the girl next door. This is horrendous.
And the prior, so we'll build like the surrounding scene now. The prior year, well, we had Martin Luther King was murdered. Robert Kennedy was murdered. Yeah, this was an extremely turbulent time. And then this guy, John Norman Collins, gets arrested. So what was kind of the reaction to it at that time from the general public?
I think it was one of massive relief. And I think the police authorities were relieved. I'm sure they were relieved because they wanted to catch this guy, but there was an element of saving their own reputations too, which were suffering. And I think that kind of informed an environment where the unsolved cases weren't really looked into very much for decades, really. They were pretty much attributed to Collins. I think everybody wanted to put it to bed. There was some shock among people as far as how he appeared. That was a common refrain in media, was that he was an all-American boy, perfect, athlete, good student, gentleman, all this stuff. And the documentary goes into why he appeared that way, but to anybody close to him in his circle, it was apparent he was a criminal, and there were a lot of signs. But that image carried him very far.
Reading the Collins case and looking at some of the Collins files, I did not think this is an all-American boy. He was engaged in criminal behavior. There were signs there. There's the myth of the serial killer, right? And they are specialized in homicide. They're really just criminals who kill people. They're committing arson, they're committing burglary, they're committing theft, they're committing sexual assault. Homicide is one of the things that they're doing, taking what they want from people whenever they want it, and they're taking it how they want it.
And yeah, I think you said he only ended up getting charged with one murder because the police found it easier to charge him with one rather than, let's say, the 7 that they might have suspected him of doing, right?
Yeah, that's part of it. Some of them, to be fair, without DNA, which wasn't even really exist until 20 years after that in any form. Even if you got, I had a forensic, one of the forensic officers on the scene at the time explained to me, even if you had blood, you could type it, but you could not say it came from a certain person. You could say it came from 30% of the population, maybe. So really definitive proof, unless there was a fingerprint or a bullet, that was, it was very difficult to prove. And a lot of these crimes, there just wasn't a lot of physical evidence at the scene that was definitive. In most of the other cases that you can, argue Collins was involved, it's largely circumstantial evidence. Although not all. Alice Calem's case, they had some good physical evidence. In the case in California, they had pretty slam dunk physical evidence.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it became a thing where it was unfortunately, these things are complicated to prosecute and they're expensive, which plays into it. So I think once they had him on one and they got him on life, I think they did do some investigating for a few years, but I know that in 1974, they changed the Michigan State Police changed the basically moved them from cold case to essentially solved, and it just said attributable to John Norman Collins, which meant that nobody worked on it for 20, 30 years. The trial was very well covered, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it was the most expensive trial, certainly in the county, if not the state, at that time. And it was very long and drawn out. And I think, especially Collins and his defense team, I think they thought they had a real chance of beating the charges because a lot of the evidence was fairly circumstantial. Although they did convict him regarding some hair samples, that involved some lab work and stuff. But my film does not get into the trial too much. There was an earlier version that had it, but it was just something I had to cut out because ultimately, for the narrative of the film, the important thing is that he was convicted.
I guess I do want to ask, though, do you think if the police didn't come, 2 days before then, that, kind of that mishap that the police made, do you think that they would have had a lot more evidence on him to convict him for several more murders, or?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I fully believe that it sounds like he had victims' clothing because he kept souvenirs, which a lot of serial killers do. And, some of that, if they had a piece of clothing that was torn and had blood on it that matched the victim's blood type, that would be a conviction, back then even. So, I think, but that's just one of kind of a long series of mistakes in this case, which, aren't, some of them are innocent and some of them I think not so much, or some of it was negligence or poor cooperation between departments.
So he's convicted and he gets life, but he still maintains his innocence up to this day, right?
Yep. As far as I know, he's kind of willing to tell different people or imply to different people that others to try to blame an accomplice, but he won't say anything on record. You can only speculate why. I kind of think he's tried a lot of strange ways to get out, which you may have read about. And I kind of wonder if he just...
Like a Shawshank Redemption type thing, right? Didn't he try to burrow a hole or something?
Yeah. In several cases, it sounded like he got kind of screwed over by those he was collaborating with. And I get a sense that maybe people... for example, his last name, is actually Chapman, or his birth name. He changed it back in the 80s, and then he applied as a Canadian citizen to be moved to a Canadian prison where he could get out on parole. And all of the paperwork was going through. He had even been transferred to a holding facility downstate where he was maybe a week from being moved to Canada. And a fellow prisoner from the UP called somebody anonymously, I believe at the Free Press or News, and said, this guy's a psycho. You can't let him out. He's doing this scheme. And then it got massive coverage, and the state pulled back and made sure he didn't get over to Canada. But he's tried a lot of stuff like that. And that's kind of what I think is, maybe his last ditch effort is maybe I'll shift some blame, or if there's any way I can get out, that is his primary thing. And he doesn't really gain anything by admitting to this stuff.
And so he's still alive, and where is he at now? What prison is he at?
Now he's near Jackson. Okay. And all I know is that it's a facility for, it's a prison facility focused on medical care.
Okay.
And he is older, in his late 70s now. And his security clearance, I noticed in the last year, has been dropped from the maximum to whatever the next down. So I think he must be pretty ill or immobile. I wrote some letters with him years ago, but I haven't heard from him in years. So I'm not really sure what condition he's in. But as far as I know, he's still alive.
All right, and then I want to get into the part of your documentary where it's insinuated that there were other people involved in these murders, and you said, like, in your email to me that it's possible that this was a group of, like, criminal accomplices, right?
Yes.
Yes. So, yeah, how did you figure that out? And, I mean, what kind of evidence is there of that?
When I first started looking at the case and, reading the books and then starting to read articles and stuff, I was struck by there were limited references to these roommates that Collins had. The ones primarily referenced are a guy named Andrew Manuel and a guy named Arnie Davis. And they were referenced and they had, stolen goods and they seemed to be lying for him. And then they seemed to kind of start to know things about some of the other murders. Then they were given basically a sort of immunity from their property crimes to testify against him at trial. And that just kind of struck me. And I thought, well, this is kind of odd. They all lived in this rooming house. It was hard for me to believe that no one around him could be aware of these things. I mean, even in a physical sense, if you think of the nature of the crimes, you would have to clean up blood. You would have, and he was always living in a rooming house and stuff. So that coupled with then when I started reading about that second murder of Joan Schell, that she was literally picked up by three guys in a car. And, in the most charitable version of this story, those two men, whatever happened, knew that she was last seen with their friend John Collins and never came forward. So I guess I just, you probably hear it in my voice, I got frustrated by that. And then the more I dug into it and the more I talked to people, including officers from the time, there's not a lot of people that will say it definitively, because I think honestly they, most of them don't know definitively, but there was no reluctance from some of the old, detectives or the sheriff and whatever I talked to bring up, oh yeah, his roommate, he was weird and we were trying to get him too. And, then when I started reading the newspapers, many of the crimes, it would be reported at the time that they were looking for a group or that there were signs of multiple people. I talked to the fiance of Joan Schell, and he was being her fiance, he was interrogated by the police for a while, and they were repeatedly saying to him, who were your friends? Who was with you? We know there was multiple people there. We know she got picked up by multiple guys. There's footprints all over the ground, et cetera, et cetera. And then just the more I dug into it, and then I started getting some police documents. I did a FOIA request and got a whole bunch of police documents I spent several years studying. There was ample evidence of those close to him absolutely he knew he was a criminal, and on a much larger scale that's been reported. It'll say, you'll read that he stole motorcycles. He stole motorcycles. He was breaking and entering into houses. He was opening all kinds of fake credit cards across town. They were, stealing openly at the university. He was like a criminal, which also is very common for serial killers to kind of graduate from lesser criminal behavior. He also had a history of sexual assault that was always unreported, kind of due to the time, I think. And so anyway, all that kind of added up. And then you'd have to, I guess, I won't say it all, but there are like specific things I'd point out in the film and make a case for. It's circumstantial evidence, but it's pretty, I think, damning and hard to explain. And again, the most charitable version of this is there were people in his circle who knew what was going on, and they covered for him or didn't report it.
Yeah.
And, but I'm fairly convinced that several people participated in at least some of the crimes.
Wow. And there was actually one crime that was done in California, right? And John Norman Collins went to a hospital for poison oak.
Yeah.
And didn't Andrew Manuel join him in California too?
Yes, Andrew Manuel went out there with him, and they had been criminal buddies for a little while. The interesting thing about him, not only was he out there, but they left pretty soon after. That woman's name was Roxy Phillips. They ended up finding a piece of her belt in his car back in Michigan, which is pretty damning evidence. It's hard to explain. But anyway, they left pretty rapidly after, and there was another murder in the area of a woman whose remains identified, who was shot with a .22 pistol and laid by the side of the road, like some of the other victims. And the next day, in files that I have, they switched their license plate to a stolen one and drove back across the country and ditched the trailer they had. So they were leaving in a rush and not wanting to be identified. And then when the final murder happened, Andrew Manuel sold a bunch of stolen goods, but kept a .22 pistol, which then he lost somewhere before the police found him, and that was never recovered. So I don't know why you would be trying to run away with a .22 pistol that might, match several crimes and get rid of it if you didn't have something to do with it.
Yeah, and I guess, the point being, though, is that all of this, there was so much evidence that was lost, too, and not investigated, and so that's why it's just hard to pin down exactly who might have committed those 6 other murders that John Norman Collins wasn't convicted for, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm fairly convinced that he was the main perpetrator. Everyone I talked to thought that, but there's definitely a feeling that he had support and accomplices on at least some of these murders.
At least covering up or even taking part in some of the assault before the murder, right?
Possibly. There are some circumstantial indications of that too. Yeah. But again, nothing definitive. Now, today, if that were the case, DNA might have very rapidly shown that there were 2 perpetrators.
Mm-hmm. And then Gary Earl Lederman was convicted for the murder of Jane Mixer. So, we do know also one of these murders that was thought to be John Norman Collins for a long time was actually somebody else. So it seems like there was just multiple police missteps in multiple levels of this case, right?
Yeah, what it comes down to, I mean, there's a lot of things, but the basic thing is disorganization. And some of that you have to, lay the blame on the people who were in charge, the police leadership. On another level, I think, as you mentioned before, with serial killers not being as well studied or seemingly as common as they became in the 70s and 80s, there just wasn't organization. I mean, it's kind of shocking, but they didn't even make a local task force for these murders until after the 6th murder. Before that, it was 5 different jurisdictions all sort of collaborating, but also competing with each other. Witnesses would get talked to over and over again. Certain departments would, guard information from each other. And like I said, some of that you have to blame leadership, and some of it was just, this was kind of unprecedented.
I guess last question is, Andrew Manuel and the other guy, has there been anything, have they gone back to prison at all? Or not even back to prison, but have they ever gotten caught for anything else since these murders over this span?
No. And, Manuel, possibly, he was kind of a lifelong criminal and kind of transient guy. And I know he died in, I believe, the 90s. Okay. And he would never say anything about it. And the other guy, Arnie Davis, eventually moved out of the area and died a few years ago as well. Okay. But I couldn't find any kind of criminal record there. Wow. Although, again, speculation, but there are many notable cases of serial killers working in teams. And the common way it occurs is perhaps there's a dominant figure and then sub-dominant figures. And it's entirely possible that Collins was the sort of ringleader or main force behind it. and the others kind of, as hard as it is to imagine, joined in or participated and then never had the impulse on their own to do it again.
Okay. Yeah, because
and I do want to say that I think there may be people besides those two individuals as well.
Okay. Well, and yeah, like that's kind of the thing with serial killers is that usually they take a joy in doing all these things, and so that's for sure. Like the thing about John Norman Collins, he ended up getting arrested, and these murders kind of stopped happening. Andrew Manuel and the other guy, as far as we know, never did a murder again. So, like, yeah, that's the kind of evidence there that John Norman Collins was the main guy in all this. But I could kind of see maybe these two other guys, at the very least, knew about everything going on and just didn't.
Yeah, I mean, they absolutely knew. I have no doubt of that.
Yeah.
And actively tried to cover up evidence and things. The other thing I would say is, interestingly, and now this is a particularly extreme form of it, but it's not uncommon, and there has been literature written on this about, say, sexual assault in fraternities. Very often there's perhaps a ringleader or instigators and a bunch of people who participate in sex crimes, for example, that never have anything else in their record or don't seem to be the type to do it, but something about the group dynamic has this happen. So it's not at all unprecedented. This would just be a particularly extreme version of it.
Is there anything, last thing you want to say about like kind of the making of this film and or just kind of what this all means to the general context of now, I guess? Why, why make this film now?
Well, I think there's a lot of, reflections to things going on now. I mean, there's a lot of similar issues, social issues, huge generational gap and political gaps between people. There's been a lot of stuff lately about protests and student protests and how the police respond to that. So, and things like sex crimes and everything, all of this stuff is still very relevant, but this is looking at it through the lens of 55 years ago. And I just think one of the people I interviewed for the film is a criminologist, and she said, we can learn something from every cold case. And I thought by looking at these through social context, maybe it could dispel some myths about serial killers and just kind of inform the public about a fascinating and strange time in local history. The only other thing I'd like to say about the movie is, emphasize this was a 7-year passion project with a very small team, called in every favor, everything to do it. And we worked really hard on it. And now we're just trying to get it screened. And we hope people come out and see it. But as, an indie film, we don't have a marketing agency. We don't have any big backers. So if you're interested in the topic or you want to come check out a screening, go to our website, 1969doc.com. That's DOC. And then on Facebook, we're 1969 Documentary, and on Instagram, we're 1969 Movie. And yeah, any kind of support we can get from the community would be massively appreciated.
Well, you heard it here first. Support local cinema, please, and support 1969 Killers, Freaks, and Radicals. Go to 1969doc.com. And thank you for talking to me, Andrew. And that is a Firelake Chat. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Things were changing in the 60s. They were changing, and they were changing fast.
Students' unrest continued in Ann Arbor.
We had the Michigan murders, the campus riots, Vietnam War protesters.
Abortion was illegal, pot was illegal, from sunrise to sunset. Demonstrations, building seizures and takeovers.
It wasn't unheard of to have violence.
It was just chaos.
Women felt vulnerable and helpless.
Terrified of this killer.
Making sure when we go out, we go in groups and don't go by yourself anyplace.
There was a big conflict with the older generation. They said, we're looking among the freaks and radicals and hippie element for the killer.
There's the myth of the serial killer, and it's all about our fascination with monsters.
To our parents' generation, the ideal was clean-cut, tall, handsome, join fraternities, play football.
There's no way he'd be a serial killer.